My name is Daniel Mercer, and I have been a certified cave diver in the United States for 12 years. I've spent most of my time exploring submerged karst systems across Florida and Texas, but nothing has ever compared to the labyrinths under southern Kentucky. I'm writing this because people keep asking why I quit a career I supposedly loved, why I sold all my gear, why I don't even snorkel anymore. They think I'm exaggerating when I say something happened underground, something simple, physical, not supernatural, not mystical, that broke me in a way nothing else has. I'm doing my best to tell it cleanly, and as accurately as that day allows. The incident happened 6 months ago, but every detail is still pinned in my mind like it's happening right now. It was early morning near Hart County, where a private landowner had granted temporary access to a partially flooded cave system connected to the Mammoth Cave watershed. My partner that day was Ellis Keaton, one of the steadiest, calmest divers I've ever known. He'd done deep penetrations, tight squeezes, emergency recoveries, you name it. He didn't scare easily, and I trusted him more than anyone underground. We reached the cave entrance just before sunrise. Kentucky fog was hanging low, clinging to the treetops and the limestone mouth of the sinkhole like something alive. The air had that cold mineral smell you only get around fresh karst systems, and the small opening in the rock exhaled a steady breath of chilled air. Felt like the cave was aware of us. Ellis checked his gauges and nodded toward the line reels, the spare lights, the tanks, our usual ritual. Nothing felt wrong yet. Nothing hinted at what was coming. We descended through the dry upper chamber, our boots clinking against the old steel ladder bolted to the rock. As soon as we hit the lower level, the shine of our lights hit the pool. Clear water. Good visibility. Stable, calm surface. From the initial look, it should have been a textbook dive. A simple survey run meant to confirm some new branching passages that a previous team had mapped weeks earlier. The plan was in and out within 3 hours. I clipped the guideline to the anchor point, checked my primary light, secondary and backup, and then slipped beneath the surface. That first moment underwater always feels like stepping into a different timeline. The world above vanishes instantly. Sound drops, color narrows, thoughts sharpen. The overhead environment closes like a lid. The water was colder than I expected. Not freezing, but cold enough that it moved up my spine in a way that made me inhale through the regulator a little too fast. The limestone tunnel ahead was narrow but navigable, the kind of long, steady corridor you get from flowing water cutting stone for thousands of years. Scribbled markings from the previous survey team glowed back at us, following the walls like a dotted invitation deeper. About 10 minutes in, the passage began tightening. We knew to expect it. The surveys had mentioned a restriction around the 70-foot mark. But the thing about cave maps is, they're more like suggestions than guarantees. I reached the choke point first, angled sideways, and squeezed through. My tank scraped the ceiling with that slow, unforgiving grind that makes every diver clench their jaw. Ellis followed. His fins disappeared through the crack, and then the two of us were fully committed. If something went wrong ahead, backing out through that squeeze would be nearly impossible in a hurry. But that's cave diving. Once you're in, you trust your planning. The tunnel opened wider on the other side. My chest loosened without me meaning to. I kept the guideline taut between my fingers, always making sure it didn't snag on the jagged pockets of rock. We drifted deeper, our lights cutting through long curtains of silt that hung motionless until our movement disturbed them. At 120 feet in, the water temperature dropped again. Not dramatically, but sharply enough that Ellis tapped my arm and pointed at his wrist computer. It showed a brief cold pocket. Nothing unusual technically, but still weirdly abrupt. I remember the way he tilted his head, like he was listening to something. I didn't hear anything at the time. I wish I hadn't later. We moved on. Then we reached a fork. The map said the left branch led to a stable chamber and the right was still unmapped. Our job was to verify that the left chamber's depth readings matched the previous data. Easy, predictable, safe. Except the guideline we'd laid ended abruptly. Not cut, not tangled, but as if someone had unspooled it cleanly, extended it further down the unmapped right passage, then tied it back onto itself as if that had been the plan all along. I froze. Ellis floated beside me, steady, his beam sweeping over the knot. Whoever tied it knew what they were doing. Clean, tight, technically perfect. But no one had been scheduled to dive here in the last 48 hours. Access required written authorization. The landowner only approved one team per day. We were the only team. Ellis made the "you seeing this?" motion. I nodded. The water felt different now, thicker, like it pressed against us. We hovered there, saying nothing, while the silt around our lights slowly rose in thin threads like dust disturbed in a quiet room. That was the moment I should have turned back. The moment my body whispered, not in fear, but in recognition, that something ahead wasn't supposed to be touched. But Ellis tapped the line clip and gave the signal to continue. And because we'd always trusted the line, always followed it, always believed in protocol, I followed him into a passage no human had officially mapped, and into the first sign that we were not alone down there. The moment we drifted into that unmapped passage, the water felt heavier, as if it wrapped around my shoulders and ribs with a slow, deliberate squeeze. I kept one hand on the guideline and one on my light, following the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Ellis pushed slightly ahead of me, his fins moving in careful, practiced strokes that kicked up only the faintest trails of silt. The stone around us shifted from pale limestone to darker bands of mineral, denser, smoother, carved by older water. It didn't feel like the rest of the cave. It felt colder, and not just in temperature. We moved deeper. The tunnel narrowed again, but not to the point of concern. It was just tight enough to force us into single file, with me watching Ellis's tank occasionally brush the sides. His light beam curved forward and vanished into the dark ahead. About 50 feet in, he stopped abruptly. I braked, stabilizing myself in the water column. Ellis turned partially toward me and pointed his primary light down at something on the floor of the tunnel. I descended a few inches to get a better look. A groove. Long, clean, straight. Not a natural channel, not an eroded line, but something that scraped the rock in a way that felt deliberate. Whatever made it had moved forward, not sideways, and with force. It was narrow, maybe 2 inches wide, but deep enough that I could see the exposed lighter stone beneath. Ellis's eyebrows pinched behind his mask. He pointed again at the direction of the groove, as if to say, "It goes further." I nodded, but my gut twisted. Anything that strong shouldn't have been in a flooded corridor like this. Not a crawler. Not an animal. Not a piece of equipment. Nothing that belonged underwater. Still, we continued. The groove led ahead into a corridor slightly steeper than the previous ones, dipping at maybe a 15-degree angle. As we followed it, the silt got thicker. Not the usual dusting of disturbed sediment. This was heavy, cloud-like, hanging as if someone had swept through violently not long ago. I kept glancing at my wrist computer. Depth stable. Pressure normal. No equipment issues. But my heartbeat kept fluttering faster than I wanted it to. Ellis reached the next section first. I saw the moment he froze. His fins stilled mid-kick, his shoulders going rigid. I drifted closer, angling my light past him, trying to see what had stopped him. Took a second before I understood. The groove didn't continue. It ended, abruptly, like whatever made it suddenly lifted off the stone and vanished upward. The tunnel ceiling above us was smooth. No cracks, no vertical fissures, no openings, just solid rock. The groove ended below it like it had hit an invisible ceiling, or like something had been pulled straight up through water without breaking the surface. I felt that cold pulse again move across my back. Ellis raised his light to the ceiling and held it there a moment too long. I tapped his arm, a small signal. "Let's keep moving or turn back. Don't linger." He nodded, but I could feel his unease. We both turned our attention to the guideline. Whoever extended it into this passage had tied it securely, but the direction it led was wrong. Instead of following the natural curve of the corridor, it pivoted abruptly left into a slit in the rock no bigger than a narrow canyon crack. Barely enough for a diver with tanks to squeeze through. There was no way a survey team would have chosen that direction voluntarily. Not unless they were forced. Ellis turned to me, hand signals quick and decisive. We follow the line. We document. We return. Protocol. Always protocol. I hesitated only a second before replying with the same hand signal. Proceed carefully. He moved in first, rotating his shoulders to slip into the crack. I followed close behind, keeping the guideline between my fingers. The rock pressed inward on both sides, scraping lightly against our tanks. Every exhale puffed bubbles that struck the ceiling inches above my head. The crack twisted once, twice, then it opened. A chamber, large, deep, and filled with suspended sheets of silt that swayed in slow motion, like underwater curtains caught in a gentle draft. But there was no current, no reason for movement. Ellis hovered at the entrance, his light sweeping across the space. That's when I saw it. A second guideline, not ours, not the one we followed. A completely separate real line stretched taut across the chamber, anchored to a rock spur on the left wall, then disappearing into darkness on the far side. The reel itself, an aluminum spooled unit, floated just above the floor, partially buried in silt. It wasn't old. It wasn't rusted. Someone had dropped it recently. Very recently. Ellis drifted toward it slowly, the movement slow enough that I could see his breathing rate rising by the bubbles streaming faster past his head. I stayed back a few feet, scanning the chamber with my light. My beam caught something on the floor, a patch of disturbed sediment shaped like a partial handprint. For impressions, the thumb smeared away, human-sized, but uneven. I blinked hard, looked again, gone, just silt shifting. Ellis reached the abandoned reel and picked it up, wiping away the silt with a gloved thumb. The serial number was intact. One glance told me everything. This belonged to a diver named Kent Davenport. He'd vanished 3 months ago while surveying an adjacent system. His partner never returned either. No one knew where their line had gone. Until now. My throat tightened around the regulator. Ellis turned, his eyes wide behind the mask. His body language said it before he even made the hand signal. "We need to get out. Now." I nodded sharply. We began to turn back. Slow, controlled, no sudden movements. Cave diving rule number 1. Panic is death. But just as we backed toward the narrow crack we'd come through, the water behind us shifted. Not a current, not movement from us. Something displaced the water. A pressure wave gently brushed my calves, moving upward like something rising from the bottom of the chamber. Ellis whipped around, shining his light at the source. Nothing, only silt. But the disturbed sheets of sediment were now drifting with purpose, as if something had passed through them moments ago. Ellis made the move now gesture. We tucked into the crack, single file, fast but steady. And that's when something tapped the line behind me. One single, sharp tug. Not rock, not current. A deliberate pull. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Ellis saw my body stiffen and turned, but the narrow crack meant he couldn't reach me. I felt the line vibrate again. Once, then stop. I made myself exhale slowly. Then I followed Ellis without looking back. Because in that moment, in that dark, drowned passage beneath Kentucky, I knew with absolute clarity, we were not alone in the cave. And whatever else was down there, it did not want us finding Davenport's reel. Ellis moved ahead through the narrow crack, but I stayed close enough to feel the water displaced by his fins. The moment we squeezed past the midpoint, the pressure in the passage seemed to double. The water wasn't moving fast, just pressing, as if the crack was narrowing around us, sucking us inward. I kept my grip on the guideline so tight my knuckles stiffened inside my gloves. The suit felt suddenly tighter, like the water temperature was dropping again. It wasn't, at least not according to my computer, but my body didn't believe it. Ellis cleared the crack first. I saw his fins pop through the exit, saw him pivot around to guide me out. I angled my tank, pulling myself forward inch by inch, careful not to disturb the silt too much. The second I emerged into the corridor, the pressure eased. I could breathe in longer, steadier draws. Ellis gave the okay sign, 2 fingers forming a circle, but his eyes weren't calm. They flicked past me, toward the darkness behind the crack. I didn't look. You don't look when something has already touched the line behind you. You move. We followed the original guideline backward through the sloped passage, retracing our route. The groove in the rock, the long, clean scrape, seemed more sinister on the way out. It wasn't just a line. It had depth, like whatever made it had weight. We hovered above it, careful not to kick silt into a wall of cloud. 15 feet more and we'd be back at the fork where the line had been tampered with. I heard something, not through my ears. Sound doesn't travel through a sealed mask, but through the bone of my jaw where the regulator pressed. A dull, low vibration, not mechanical, organic, like a slow, sustained hum rolling through the stone. Ellis stopped instantly. His body went rigid, motionless except for the rise and fall of his breath. He turned his head slightly toward the wall. I did the same. The vibration faded, then returned. Stronger. A slow, rhythmic pulse, each one spaced maybe 3 seconds apart. Not like machinery, more like breath, but deeper, heavier, as if the cave itself was inhaling and exhaling through rock. Ellis pointed to his wrist. Time to go. Fast. I agreed. We kicked forward, fins cutting the water at a controlled, urgent pace. The silt behind us spun into swirling clouds that followed like shadows. When we reached the main fork, I immediately saw something wrong. The tampered guideline, the one someone had tied into the unmapped right passage, was slack now. Loose, no longer pulled taut deeper into the dark. The free end drifted like it had been released. Ellis grabbed it, examined the knot again. Perfect craftsmanship. No sign of stress or cutting. No fray. He shook his head sharply and pointed toward the restriction ahead, the squeeze we'd passed earlier. We started for it. Halfway there, our lights flickered. Not drained. Shadowed. As if something had passed briefly between us and the beams. I didn't see a shape. Only a sudden, sharp dimming, like someone had held up a hand in front of a flashlight for a fraction of a second. Ellis spun around, sweeping his light behind us. Nothing but silt drifting. I checked my tank pressure. Good. Breathing steady. Air supply solid. Regulators normal. No equipment issues. So why did the water feel like it was vibrating around us? We reached the restriction. This was the part I dreaded. Getting back through the narrow squeeze while your brain is screaming that something is behind you. Ellis signaled, I go first. I nodded. He turned sideways and slipped into the choke point. His tank scraped the rock with that long metallic screech that every cave diver hates. He disappeared halfway through, wriggled, and then fully vanished into the opening beyond. My turn. I aligned my tank, angled one shoulder, and eased forward. The rock pressed my ribs on one side and my tank on the other. Every breath expanded my chest too much, so I forced myself to take smaller draws. The rock overhead seemed lower than before. My regulator knocked lightly against it. Halfway through the squeeze, the vibration came back. Harder this time, like something was moving water behind me. I kept going. The vibration became a low surge, pushing the water forward in a pulse that nudged my fins. Not violently, just enough to tell me something had displaced a large volume of water. Then the guideline pulled tight in my hand. Just for a second. Not Ellis. Not natural tension. A tug. I yanked the line toward me instinctively, afraid it would snag or break. The movement forced my tank harder against the ceiling. The metal scraped, sending a biting vibration through my spine. I sucked in a sharp breath through the regulator. Not smart because my chest expanded and wedged tighter between the rocks. I forced myself to exhale slowly, shrinking just enough to slide forward. Another pulse of water hit me from behind. Ellis's hand grabbed mine. He pulled hard, guiding me free of the squeeze. The moment my tank cleared the rock lip, my entire body shot out into the wider corridor like a cork freed from a bottle. We hovered there, both panting, bubbles rising in frantic streams. I looked at the restriction. The silt behind it was swirling unnaturally, spiraling upward even though there was no current. Like something had brushed along the floor and then risen toward the ceiling. Ellis didn't wait. He tapped my shoulder twice. Go now, and started swimming toward the entrance with tight, controlled kicks. I followed close, clutching the guideline so hard it felt like a lifeline to the surface world. 10 minutes to safety, maybe less. The tunnel widened enough for side-by-side movement, so Ellis stayed close, constantly sweeping behind us with his light. Every time he turned the beam backward, I saw the same thing. The silt was following. Not drifting. Following. Like a slow, stalking cloud. My breathing rate rose. I forced it down. You cannot panic in an overhead environment. There is no direct descent. No emergency exit. Only forward. Then the vibration stopped. All at once. The water went unnaturally still. My stomach dropped. Because stillness in a cave is rarely a good thing. Ellis slowed but didn't stop. His eyes darted across the ceiling, the walls, the floor. Movement. Not behind us. Above us. A faint ripple, circular. Like something had moved across the ceiling without touching it. Ellis grabbed my arm. His grip trembled. We kicked harder. Only a few hundred feet to the exit chamber now. Once there, we could ascend into the dry air pocket, regroup, and breathe real air again. But just as the chamber came into view, the guideline jerked in my hand. Hard. Hard enough to whip the line once, like something had seized it. I spun around instinctively, raising my light. And for the first time I saw a shape. Not clear. Not defined. Just a mass of darker water sliding toward us with purpose, and with speed no natural underwater movement has. Ellis didn't signal. He bolted. And so did I, because whatever was behind us wasn't just following anymore. It was closing the distance. Ellis shot forward with a force I'd never seen from him, cutting through the water in a tight, streamlined line. I kept right on his fins, matching his kicks even as panic pressed against the back of my throat. The corridor ahead glowed with our lights, but it felt narrower than before, as if the rock was leaning in. The guideline between my fingers shook violently with each of our movements, but there was another tremor beneath it. Small, quick, deliberate pulses that weren't coming from either of us. Behind us, the dark mass moved faster. I didn't have to look to know that it was gaining. I could feel it in the pressure waves brushing against my calves, in the faint shifts of cold water that spiraled upward along my back. It wasn't like any animal movement I recognized. It was too smooth, too directed, too intentional. We reached the entrance chamber, a broad, dome-shaped cavern with an air pocket above. The water line shimmered in our lights. If we surfaced there, we could catch our breath, regroup, maybe figure out an exit route through the dry passages. But Ellis didn't surface. He didn't even glance up. He pointed at the slope leading to the final tunnel, our way out. He wasn't risking losing visibility. If the thing behind us stirred up the chamber, it could trap us in a suspended storm of silt so thick we'd lose all sense of direction. People have died that way. Good divers. Better divers than me. We kicked forward. The tunnel out was narrower than I remembered. The stone bulged inward on the right side, forcing us to stay close to the left wall. Our lights shone over familiar markings, scratches left by older groups who'd passed through, the faint discoloration from diverted water flows. But everything felt wrong. The water felt heavier, duller, absorbing more light than before. My fingers tightened around the guideline again, terrified I'd feel another deliberate tug. We were 50 feet from the exit, then 40, then a sound vibrated through the stone. A low, resonant boom that made the regulator clatter lightly against my teeth. The water trembled around us, sending thin trails of silt drifting downward like snowflakes. I looked at Ellis. He froze mid-kick. Not fear, listening. The boom came again. Not like something striking rock. Like something inside the rock was shifting. A geological event? A micro-collapse? Maybe. But it came in intervals again, far too rhythmic, too spaced. Caves don't breathe. Rock doesn't pulse. But that was the only way I could describe it. Even worse, the water temperature dropped several degrees in seconds. I felt the cold seize my wrists and forearms, creeping beneath the glove seams. Ellis's bubbles became ragged bursts. He was spooked. Badly. We kicked harder. The final rise toward the exit passage was only a gentle incline, but it felt steep, like swimming uphill through syrup. The guideline began shaking violently in my grasp. Not pulled this time, but vibrating from something ahead of us, not behind. I didn't understand at first, but then our lights hit the disturbance. The silt in the exit tunnel was funneling inward, not drifting randomly, not following our movement, but spiraling tightly as if being drawn toward a point deeper in the rock. Like the cave itself was inhaling. Ellis jerked his hand toward the side corridor branching off to the right, a narrow detour I barely remembered from our descent. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't mapped, but it bypassed the main exit squeeze and eventually reconnected to the same surface pool. He didn't wait for confirmation. He angled right. I followed. The moment we turned into the side corridor, our lights bounced back at us from a thick curtain of silt. The entire passage was clouded, milky, and swirling. A diver had been through recently, too recently. Ellis slowed, bracing one hand against the wall. Then we saw it, a single scrape mark. Fresh, long curved, as if something huge had been dragged sideways across the stone. Not the same kind of groove as earlier, this one was wider, deeper, and it wasn't straight. It arced around the corner in a smooth, unnatural path. Ellis looked directly at me. I could feel what he wanted to signal even before he moved his hand. We're not alone in this tunnel either. We pressed on, staying close to the wall, relying more on touch than sight. The silt swallowed our beams, turning everything to a dull gray haze. My breathing rate rose dangerously, but I forced myself to slow it. CO2 panic kills more divers than anything else underground. We reached a split in the tunnel. Left, narrow, descending. Right, wider, ascending. The guideline didn't extend here. This was virgin passage for us, and we didn't have time to mark it cleanly. Ellis pointed right, up meant air. We moved. The silt thinned slightly as we ascended, revealing faint rock textures again. My heartbeat slowed a fraction. Then my light hit something on the wall. A glove. A neoprene glove wedged into a crack, fingers bent in a way no diver would leave intentionally. The brand was familiar. Davenport. Ellis grabbed it, examined it, then shook his head sharply and shoved it into my hand. That's when the pulse came again. Hard. The water slammed into us from behind, knocking my mask slightly off seal and sending a rush of icy water across my cheek. I cleared it automatically, but the sudden force made my pulse spike. Ellis spun, shining his light behind us. For a split second, just long enough to doubt my sanity, I saw a distortion in the water, a bulge, as if something massive was shifting within the silt cloud, displacing the space behind it. Then the silt exploded outward. A shock wave of water blasted past us, sending us tumbling. Ellis crashed into the ceiling and ricocheted downward, right into the wider corridor. I spun sideways, hitting the wall with my shoulder tank strap, pain shooting down my ribs. I grabbed the rock to steady myself. Ellis grabbed the guideline segment we'd run earlier, thank God, and pulled himself upright. His light cut toward me. He motioned, move. Move now. The water shifted again. Closer. I kicked hard, forcing my legs to cooperate despite the throbbing pain in my side. We shot upward into the sloped tunnel, the silt roaring behind us like a storm. Chased us, literally chased us, up the incline, swallowing every inch we just passed through. 20 more feet. 10. Then, a shimmer. The water lightened. We broke into a second chamber. This one was smaller, its rock walls glistening with droplets that hinted at a thin air pocket above. Ellis pointed upward, face tight behind the mask. Surface. Now, we kicked up. My head broke the water first. Cold air slapped my face. I pulled my regulator out and froze, because on the limestone ledge only a few feet from the waterline were drag marks, fresh, white, deep, leading into the dark passage above. And whatever made them wasn't done. The rock dust was still falling. The drag marks on the limestone looked impossible to ignore, long, parallel impressions carved into the rock by something heavy, something with enough force to scrape stone, but still leave a smooth, continuous path. No broken grooves, no chipped debris, just two long trails, darkened by moisture, disappearing into the narrow dry passage above the ledge. Ellis surfaced beside me, water streaming from his mask as he lifted it halfway, breath shaky but controlled. He saw the marks. His expression hardened, not terrified but calculating. the kind of look he gave only when something violated every expectation he had about a dive site. He motioned silently. "Do not climb up there." I nodded without hesitation. Whatever had been pulled or had crawled up that incline left tracks too fresh to question. Bits of limestone dust still floated downward, drifting onto the water around us. My heart pounded with a dull, hollow throb. The air pocket was small, maybe 3 feet tall at its highest point. The space felt cramped, the limestone ceiling dripping cold mineral water down the back of my neck. Ellis moved toward the opposite edge of the chamber, inspecting the walls with his light while staying waist-deep. He wasn't planning on getting out of the water, not unless absolutely necessary. He tapped the wall, listened. The hollow resonance told him what I already suspected. There was another flooded passage connected to this chamber. We just had to find it. My light scanned the water surface for any sign of faint currents or differences in reflection, signs of an underwater tunnel. I felt the water with my glove, slow sweeping arcs, searching for subtle directional movement. The adrenaline shaking my wrist didn't help. I steadied my breath again, forcing the rising panic down. There, a faint draw, just the slightest tug of water near the far corner where the chamber narrowed. I moved toward it, legs still kicking lightly below the surface. When I submerged my hand again, the pull became clearer, the unmistakable suction of a secondary passage. Ellis saw it too. He slid his regulator back in, gave a sharp nod, then dipped beneath the surface. I followed instantly. The entrance was small, a vertical slit barely 3 feet wide, descending at a harsh angle. Our tanks scraped the walls as we angled in, dislodging small particles of limestone that sparkled like dust in our beams. The water temperature rose slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to feel like we'd crossed into a different layer of the system. We descended slowly, keeping tight formation. My breathing sounded too loud in my head, echoing in the narrow stone throat we were dropping through. The beam of Ellis's light pointed straight down into the black, swallowed quickly by the steep descent. 20 feet. 30. The passage opened abruptly, and we slid into a larger flooded corridor, tall enough to stand in if it weren't underwater. My light reflected off smooth stone walls striated with mineral bands aged older than human history. The water here was unervingly clear, too clear, as if nothing living had disturbed it for a very long time. Ellis held up a hand. "Stop." He swept his light across the floor. A thin layer of silt lay perfectly undisturbed, except for one thing. A single path had been dragged through it. Long, wide, straight, the same width as the drag marks above the waterline. My chest tightened. Something had moved through this tunnel recently. Very recently. The silt should have settled long before we arrived, unless the disturbance was fresh. Ellis signaled, "We keep moving. Current direction." I nodded. We stayed low but fast, following the faint pull of water deeper into the passage. I kept glancing behind us, expecting to see the distortion again, the bulge of darker water, that impossible movement closing distance. We reached a bend where the tunnel sloped upward again. The silt layer here was thicker, softer, as if the cave floor had been carved by years of slow water flow. I kicked gently to avoid disturbing it. Ellis did the same. Halfway around the bend, my light hit something pale. I froze. At first I thought it was a rock. Then more of it came into view. Edges, curves, a rectangular shape. Ellis saw it too and drifted closer, cautious but drawn like gravity. It was a dive tablet, a slate the type used by survey divers for mapping. And attached to it, still clipped by a corroded aluminum carabiner, was a fragment of a harness strap. The initials scratched into the slate were unmistakable. KD, Kent Davenport. My lungs seized, and I had to force myself to exhale or risk floating upward too quickly. Ellis approached the slate, hands steady despite the shaking beam of his light. He turned the tablet over slowly. On the back, scrawled with frantic, carved strokes deep enough to scratch the plastic, were 3 words: "Don't follow sound." My throat tightened around the regulator. My heartbeat thudded so hard the strap of my mask vibrated. Ellis backed away slowly, as if the slate itself were a threat. He gestured upward, The tunnel continued to rise, and that was our exit route. We resumed moving, both of us quicker now. The water shifted again, not violently, but with purpose. A subtle wave moved past my ankles. Then another. The tunnel ceiling above us narrowed to a low arch. Our tanks scraped lightly, stirring more silt. Somewhere behind us, faint but unmistakable, came a low tremor. A sound. Not booming this time, not pulsing, just a slow, dragging resonance that vibrated the water before it reached our ears. Like something enormous was moving across stone. Ellis snapped his light behind us. The tunnel was empty, but the silt we'd carefully avoided disturbing was rising, lifted, as if something beneath it was pushing upward. Ellis turned back toward me. No hand signal this time. His eyes behind the mask said everything. Go. We kicked hard up the incline, the tunnel slanting ever sharper toward air. My legs burned, and my tank strap dug into bruised ribs from the earlier impact, but I didn't slow. The water ahead brightened slightly, reflected light from an air pocket. We reached it together, broke the surface, and immediately we knew something was wrong. The air pocket wasn't a chamber. It was a shaft, tall, narrow, like a vertical throat carved upward into the rock. Moist air rolled down its walls, carrying a metallic smell I couldn't place. Something like wet iron and stale earth. But that wasn't the part that froze my blood. The drag marks continued here, up the wall, vertical. Something had climbed out of the water and gone straight up, leaving gouges in the limestone that trailed into the darkness above us. And the dust at the bottom? Still drifting. Ellis kept his regulator between his teeth even after surfacing. He didn't trust the air. I didn't either. The shaft above us stretched upward like a chimney, slick walls reflecting only a fraction of our lights. Each time a droplet fell from the upper ledges, the tiny splash echoed far too long, like the space above us wasn't empty at all, but filled with twisting hallways or hollow pockets waiting to throw the sound back. The drag marks were unmistakable, running straight up the shaft wall for at least 15 feet before they curved out of beam range. Something had climbed, not slipped, not been pulled, climbed. I stared at them longer than I should have, noting the grooves. Wide, deep, yet oddly even, without the erratic scraping you'd expect from hands or claws. Whatever made them had moved with purpose. Ellis tapped my arm, snapping me back. He pointed toward the opposite side of the shaft where the water shifted in a subtle but unnatural pattern. A faint ripple moved against the natural current, an inward pull, like the cave was inhaling again. No sound this time, no vibration, just the movement of water. The worst kind of warning. He signaled down, back to water, find another passage. Neither of us said up the shaft, because neither of us intended to follow the path of whatever had climbed, and neither of us believed we could survive long enough to see what was above. I bit the regulator, took one controlled breath, and submerged with him. The water felt warmer than before, but not comfortably, more like a stagnant temperature held in a sealed pocket. As we descended into the tunnel, I double-checked all my gear touching the rock. The dragging resonance behind us had stopped, but the lack of noise felt worse. Silence underwater isn't peaceful. It's the perfect environment for your imagination to start filling gaps. But this wasn't imagination. Something had made those marks. Something had moved that silt. Something had touched the guideline behind me. We swam downward, staying close to the tunnel floor where the silt was thickest. That's when my light fell on something tiny. Fibers. A torn piece of webbing. Black, frayed, caught on a small limestone spur. I recognized the pattern instantly. It matched the harness material from the slate we found earlier. I motioned to Ellis, and he hovered beside me. He didn't touch it, just stared. If Davenport came through here, he was alive long enough to lose this strap. But the drag marks told a different story about how he might have left. Ellis pointed forward again. Keep moving. We drifted along the incline until the tunnel widened into a shallow basin. The bottom was soft with silt, untouched except for footprints. Not full prints, not crisp, but impressions on the soft sediment. Human-sized, but elongated at the heel, like someone walked underwater with weighted boots. The stride was wrong too long, too evenly spaced for someone weighted down by dive gear. And there were only prints going one direction, into the basin, none leading out. My throat clenched, and I fought to keep my inhale slow. Ellis's eyes flicked between the prince and me. He didn't want to signal it, but I saw the fear tightening at the edges of his mask. The water shifted again. This time we felt it. A slow, rolling pressure that cascaded across our backs like a wave starting somewhere deeper in the system. Ellis grabbed my BC strap and pulled me downward just as the water above bulged. Like something large had passed right over our heads. His grip tightened, nails pressing through the glove fabric. We waited, still, silent. The silt ahead of us began to rise. At first, just a little dust drifting upward as though disturbed by our lights. But then it thickened, swirling into a column that twisted upward toward the tunnel ceiling. Not random turbulence, not thin disturbance, a deliberate rise, like something beneath the silt had stirred. Ellis made a sharp cutting motion with his hand back. Now, we pushed away from the basin, retracing our path. I kept my light angled downward because part of me didn't want to see shape or movement in the water column behind us. But I could feel it, the pressure in the water thickening, the faint shift of the current beginning to pull again. When we reached the incline toward the shaft chamber, Ellis paused and swept the walls with his light. There, a fissure, a razor-thin horizontal crack barely wide enough to squeeze into. No water movement came from it, but it angled upward, away from the basin. A dry bypass route, maybe, a breathing pocket, or at least, a place the pressure behind us couldn't easily push through. Ellis signaled we try it. I felt the same calculation: our tanks might not fit. The fins might snag. If we got stuck, there'd be no room to turn around. But the water behind us kept pulsing in faint waves. We went for it. Ellis rotated sideways first, sliding his tank through the narrow horizontal slit. Stones scraped metal, loud in the enclosed space. He exhaled fully to flatten his body and disappeared into the darkness above the fissure. I followed, angling my tank at the exact pitch he used. The rock brushed my shoulders and hips, squeezing my arms inward. When I reached the tightest part, something touched my fin. A brush, not rock, not silt, something with weight. My inhale nearly made me wedge myself in the rock. I forced the breath out again and pushed forward with everything I had, scraping my chest against the limestone ceiling. The moment I cleared the fissure, Ellis grabbed my arm and yanked me upward. We surfaced into a pitch-black cavern, small, dry, and silent except for our ragged breathing. We climbed out of the water, dripping onto the cold stone floor. My shoulders ached. My ribs throbbed. Ellis pushed his mask to his forehead and leaned against the cave wall, breathing in cold gulps. The cavern wasn't big, maybe 8 feet across, but the ceiling sloped high enough that our lights couldn't trace its full shape. The walls were covered in mineral drips, long curtains of stone shaped slowly over centuries. But across the floor, more drag marks, not fresh like before, but older, smoother, as if whatever had passed through here had done so multiple times. Some curved into the water we just emerged from. Others led deeper into a narrow, dry tunnel that constricted out of view. Ellis's breath hitched when he saw what lay near the tunnel entrance. A dive light, still functional, still glowing weakly. Its beam pointed upward, illuminating the uneven wall where a single word had been carved in frantic, stabbing motions. Stay low. That was when the vibration returned. Not through the water this time, but through the rock beneath our boots. A slow, crawling resonance, moving toward us, from the dry tunnel. The vibration through the stone grew stronger, crawling up through the soles of my boots and into my knees like a shiver rising through bone. Ellis lifted his head, his eyes wide and hollow behind the film of moisture on his mask. We exchanged no hand signals now, no careful diver language, just raw, silent understanding. Something was coming down that dry tunnel. Not in the water now, on the rock. Ellis flicked his light toward the narrow tunnel leading out of the cavern. Dust drifted from the ceiling, shaken loose by the rhythmic tremor. Not fast, not heavy, Just steady, deliberate, terrifying in its consistency. We didn't know what the hell could move both through water and across dry rock without a sound that matched either environment. But we knew one thing: we could not stay standing. The carved warning, "Stay low," glowed back at us from the stone, the diving light still shining upward to illuminate it. Ellis slowly crouched, lowering himself onto hands and knees. I followed, lowering my profile, hugging close to the ground. The cavern suddenly felt smaller, the ceiling closer. The vibration became clearer, no longer just movement, but a pattern. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses again, each set slightly stronger than the one before. Ellis leaned close, whispering only with his eyes, "Move." Away from the tunnel. We crawled sideways toward the opposite corner of the cavern, where the rock dipped toward a shallow lip. The floor there was slick with mineral sheen, but at least it dipped away from the dry tunnel. My gloves slipped on the stone, and every rasp felt deafening. Then the sound reached us. Not a growl, not a breath, just a slow dragging, like a heavy object sliding across stone, but without the scrape. Weight without friction, pressure without noise. It made no physical sense, but the sound burrowed into my spine like cold metal. Ellis killed his primary light. I did the same. The cavern plunged into blackness so thick I felt blindfolded. The only illumination came from the faint, dying glow of Davenport's lost dive light pointed at the carved warning. Even that dimmed gradually until the cavern was little more than a soft smudge of shapes. The dragging sound reached the entrance of the tunnel. Stopped. My pulse hammered in my throat, so loud I thought whatever was out there could hear it. I sank lower, pressing my chest and elbows into the stone. Ellis's hand found my arm in the dark. His grip shook. Not fear, adrenaline shaking him apart. Then, a breath, right at the tunnel mouth. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It wasn't wet or dry. It was air pressure shifting abruptly, like something enormous had inhaled the warm air of the cavern and exhaled cold subterranean air to replace it. The temperature dropped instantly. Beads of moisture crystallized along the rock beside me. Ellis's hand squeezed my arm with sudden force. Something was stepping or sliding into the cavern. I didn't see it directly. I only saw the effects. The faint outline of the cavern distorted as if a massive displacement of air moved through it. The dying dive light flickered once, twice, then stabilized, illuminating just a sliver of the floor. And in that sliver, dust lifted, a faint trail in the air, as if something low to the ground was passing by. Stay low. I flattened myself completely, cheek pressed to the stone. Ellis did the same. The air pressure beside us shifted again, brushing past with a coldness that cut straight through my wetsuit like winter wind. My lungs refused to expand for a moment. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. No exit, no cover, no advantage. All we could do was stay lower than whatever was searching. The dragging resumed. Closer, closer still, until the dust near my glove spiraled upward, caught in a draft created inches from my face. I fought every muscle in my body to stay still. My heartbeat hammered so hard I feared my suit would vibrate audibly. Then, past. The cold pressure drifted toward the opposite side of the cavern, sliding along the floor. Ellis inched closer to me, moving only by shifting his elbows. He pointed, not with a gesture, but with the slightest tilt of his head, toward the pool of water we'd climbed out of. Our only chance. The dragging shifted direction, moving up the far wall now, weight transferring vertically without losing consistency. Whatever it wasn't bound by gravity the way we were. And it wasn't fast. It was deliberate, searching, mapping the cavern as if it knew its layout intimately. Ellis tapped twice on my wrist. A diver's signal. Retreat. But slowly, we slid backward, inch by inch on our stomachs, pushing ourselves toward the waterline. The cavern floor sloped gently downward there, smooth, slippery. I felt my boots reach the wet edge. Ellis dipped one foot into the water. Then the dragging stopped. Total silence. The cavern air froze around us. A breath, this time behind us, near the entrance to the fissure we had wriggled through earlier. Ellis's fingers dug into my forearm. His message was unmistakable. It knows where we came from. A faint ripple appeared on the water surface, spreading outward in tiny, perfect circles. Something was dipping close, testing. We sank together, sliding into the water as quietly as possible. I eased my regulator back in, tasting cold rubber. Ellis submerged first, disappearing silently beneath the surface. I followed. Underwater, the world became a void. The cavern ceiling above was too dark to outline properly. The water was still except for the faint shimmer of two divers sinking backward into its depths. I kept my body flat, minimizing disturbance. Ellis grabbed my hand and pulled us into the narrow slit we had forced our bodies through earlier. It was even tighter from this angle, the rock pushing into my tank and ribs. Behind us, the water shifted. Once, twice, then harder, like something large had entered the pool. Ellis wriggled himself upward through the fissure faster than before, scraping loudly. I shoved myself after him, the rock gouging my side. My tank caught on a protrusion, wrenching me sideways. Panic flared. The pressure wave hit. Cold. Massive. Right behind my fins. I kicked with everything I had, twisting, forcing my torso through the opening until my gear scraped free. Ellis grabbed my BC strap and hauled me upward. We surfaced into the original cavern where we'd fled from earlier, the one with the vertical shaft. But something was different. The air pocket was smaller. Moist air thickened the ceiling, as if water had risen, or something had displaced it. Ellis turned his light on, and both of us froze. The drag marks on the wall, they were fresh again. New gouges, closer to the waterline, as if whatever had climbed back down, and we had just missed it. Ellis's light jittered over the newest gouges in the limestone. They were unmistakably fresh, edges sharp, dust still clinging to the moisture. The marks trailed downward from the shaft wall and disappeared beneath the water we just surfaced from, meaning whatever had climbed down had passed through this chamber minutes before we returned. Maybe less. Ellis exhaled a thin, shaking breath through his regulator. I could hear it whistle around the mouthpiece. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber with sharp, frightened precision, like a diver who finally realized the map in his head no longer matched the cave around him. The air pocket was shrinking, barely an inch, but enough for us to notice. Droplets formed quickly on the ceiling, merging and dripping faster than before. Something had forced water upward, displaced the oxygen. The physics made sense. The timing didn't. Ellis tapped my shoulder and pointed toward the far side of the chamber where the slope descended back into water. Not the way we came. A different slope, one we'd ignored earlier because it submerged into a narrow funnel that looked too tight even for cave divers. But now that was our only choice. He gave the signal down. Now, we submerged again. The cold snapped against my face, pulling the heat from my skin through the regulator. Ellis descended ahead of me, carefully angling his tank to slip into the jagged funnel. I followed, keeping one hand on his fin to ensure we didn't separate in the constricting dark. The passage felt alive, not in a supernatural sense. In the geological one, stone that flexed and shifted with the weight of thousands of years. Water that pulsed with the cave's subtle inhaling currents. But the timing of the pulses did not feel random anymore. They felt synced, responsive. We dropped deeper. The funnel widened slightly after 10 feet, just enough to maneuver. Visibility was poor. Silt hung heavy from all our scrambling earlier, and our lights struggled to cut more than a few feet in front of us. Then my glove brushed something. Metal. I grabbed it without thinking, then turned it toward my light. Pressure gauge. Old. The rubber cracked. Needle frozen around 600 psi. A diver's gauge. Not Ellis's. Not mine. Davenport's? His partner's? Someone else lost before records were kept? I didn't want the answer. I let it go, and it drifted downward into the silt like a dead leaf. Ellis noticed my pause and turned, eyes asking. I shook my head and signaled keep moving. The corridor sloped gently upward. We followed it, and with each foot we gained, the water temperature dropped slightly. Not dramatically, but consistently, like we were climbing through layers of colder, untouched water. Then a vibration moved through the passage. Not the deep, slow pulse we'd felt before. This one was crisp, sharp, like a knock against the stone. 1. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. Ellis froze. I froze. Nothing in a cave knocks 3 times. He raised his hand to signal something, but the gesture cut off abruptly when the water behind us shifted. A cold wave surged through the passage, forcing silt to rise and swirl violently. I turned just in time to see the silt explode upward, choking out our visibility entirely. Ellis grabbed my wrist, hard, and dragged me forward blindly. We kicked upward through the opaque cloud, feeling our way along the rock by touch alone. The stone curved unpredictably, jagged in some places, smooth as polished bone in others. My tank struck an overhang, sending a metallic reverberation through the passage. A second later, Ellis's light beam returned, weak at first, then clearer as we emerged from the worst of the silt. The tunnel ahead opened into a vertical shaft filled entirely with water this time. No air pocket, no ledge, just a long column stretching upward out of sight. Ellis pointed up. His movements were sharp, quick. He was done conserving energy, done strategizing. This was survival-driven instinct now. We started ascending, kicking hard but controlled, spiraling slowly along the wall to avoid a mid-column silhouette that could expose us to whatever followed. A faint scratching echoed from below, rhythmic, not frantic, not confused. It followed our ascent perfectly. I kicked harder. My lungs tightened around the regulator. My body screamed for a real inhale of real air. The stone walls thinned into smoother columns, streaked with mineral deposits like curtains frozen mid-flow. Halfway up, I saw something. Not a shape, not a body, a line. A thin, taut strand of monofilament. A dive guideline. Old. No, very old. The sheath frayed. The core exposed. Tied into the wall with a knot that no modern diver used anymore. Ellis saw it too. His beam hovered on it only a moment before shifting upward again. No time. No point. The scratching grew louder. Closer. We climbed. At last, the shaft ended in an angled ceiling. A small pocket of air sat at the top, a dome no more than 2 feet high. Ellis surfaced and sucked in a ragged inhale. I followed, barely clearing the waterline before tearing the regulator out. The air was stale, warm, recycled through the cave for who knows how long, but it was air. Ellis pressed a hand to the rock, searching desperately for an exit tunnel. The dome was small, smaller than any we'd been in before. Too small for safety. Too small to hide. "We can't stay here," he whispered, voice shaking. "It's coming up the shaft." He wasn't exaggerating. The water below us rippled in slow rings, each pulse perfectly spaced, unnatural in its precision. No animal moved like that. No current rose in controlled intervals. I dunked my head briefly, listening underwater. Scrape, scrape, then a pause, long enough for my blood to run cold. Ellis shoved himself along the dome ceiling and found a small fissure near the far corner. Just big enough to push an arm through, maybe a shoulder. It wasn't a tunnel. Not yet. But something had widened it. Maybe water. Maybe time. Or maybe the water below us bulged. A shadow swelled just beneath the surface. Ellis's eyes locked onto mine. No signals. No diver protocol. Just raw human fear. "Go," he whispered. He jammed his body against the fissure, twisting, forcing stone to scrape against his tank. The metal screamed against the rock, the sound sharp enough to hurt. I followed, shoving, grinding my shoulders through the narrowing stone as pain lanced across my back. Below us, the water surface broke, not with a splash, not with bubbles, but with a slow, rising displacement, like something wider than a human torso was pushing upward. Ellis shoved himself through the fissure and vanished. My tank stuck, hard. Stone crushed into my ribs. Below me, water climbed. I could smell the cold now, a metallic scent mixed with old limestone. I pushed. The rock dug deeper. The rising shadow touched the surface beneath my boots. And for the first time that day, I felt something touch me. The moment something brushed my boot, every instinct I had, every hour of training, every emergency drill, collapsed into raw, unfiltered panic. I didn't scream, couldn't. The fissure was crushing my ribs so tightly I could barely breathe, let alone shout. But my legs kicked reflexively, scraping against the rock as I shoved myself upward with everything left in my body. The touch came again. Not a grab, not a pull, a push, a firm, deliberate pressure against my heel, upward, not downward, as if something was trying to wedge me deeper into the fissure, forcing me forward instead of dragging me back. It made no sense. Panic told me it didn't matter. My tank wedged sideways against the stone, metal grinding so loudly the vibration shot into my teeth. I angled my shoulders and twisted hard, feeling the rock bite into my suit. My back screamed from the strain, but the pressure behind me rose, water churning in tight pulses that shoved my legs again. Ellis's hand suddenly appeared above, groping blindly through the narrow slit. "Daniel!" His voice tore through the tunnel, thin and ragged. "Push! Now! Push!" I shoved upward, kicking, twisting, every muscle igniting with fire. Something below pressed again. Steady, relentless, as if the water itself had weight behind it. I didn't dare look back. I didn't dare acknowledge the shape my peripheral vision tried to form. A darker shadow rising beneath me in the shaft. My tank scraped free. I shot upward into the fissure, slamming into Ellis, nearly knocking his regulator from his mouth. He grabbed both my shoulders and dragged me into the tight chamber he'd wedged into. The rock pressed against us from all sides. The space was barely big enough for one diver, let alone two. Our helmets bumped. Our lights jittered wildly across the uneven stone. Below us, the water surged upward. Not violently, worse, slowly, deliberately, filled the fissure like a rising lung. Ellis clamped a hand over my regulator to steady it. "We need to move, now, before this fills." He pushed himself deeper into the narrowing tunnel, crawling on elbows and toes like an animal forcing itself into a den. I followed, my tank scraping overhead as the rock closed in. The air pocket above us thinned to only a few inches. Each breath tasted stale, metallic, too warm. The fissure sloped upward, but only slightly. Progress was agonizing. Behind us, the water kept rising. The sound was wrong, too controlled, too pressurized. Like something massive displaced it with every movement. My chest burned from exertion and fear. I forced another breath, but oxygen wouldn't calm the shaking in my hands. "Almost," Ellis gasped ahead of me, voice muffled. "There's something upward light." His hand vanished into darkness ahead, then came back dusted with dry grit. Dry air above us. He pushed forward harder. The tunnel widened abruptly, stone giving way to a small cavern barely 4 feet tall. Enough to stand hunched. Enough to breathe. We scrambled inside, collapsing against the uneven floor. My knees buckled. Ellis tore off his mask long enough to suck in deep gulps of air before forcing it back on. He knew the rules. Bad air pockets kill, but breathing nothing was worse. The cavern was uneven, shaped like a tilted bowl with ridges running toward a slanted tunnel on the far side. A trickle of water dripped from above, cold enough to sting the back of my neck. And then, the entire chamber shivered. Not violently, just a tremor running through the stone like something enormous brushed the cavern wall from the other side. Ellis's breath hitched. He raised his light toward the fissure we'd crawled from. Water bulged at the entrance, not surging, not spilling, but rising in a slow, deliberate mound, like something beneath the surface was forcing it upward. "Move," Ellis whispered, voice barely more than breath. "Up the slant." I staggered upright, boots slipping on wet stone. We followed the incline, hands dragging along the wall for balance. The tunnel angled up sharply, scraping our tanks until we had to remove them entirely and push them ahead of us. Each movement echoed down the stone like a beacon. We reached a fork. Left, narrower, but rising. Right, wider, sloping downward. Ellis didn't hesitate. We squeezed left, scraping shoulders until warm blood trickled down my arm. The stone pressed like ribs closing around us. My breath quickened. The tunnel felt endless, each foot gained costing more strength than the last. Then, air shifted, cooler, moving, a draft. Ellis surged forward, dragging his tank behind him. "We're close, Daniel. There's a gap, natural chimney." His light hit open space, a vertical fracture splitting the rock like lightning frozen mid-strike. Above it, a faint shimmer, not sunlight, just a paler shade of black. Fresh airflow. We climbed, hand over hand, boots searching for purchase as the chimney widened enough to move upright. My legs trembled from exhaustion. Ellis reached the top first, pulling himself through a jagged opening. Cold night air rushed in. Real air. A shock so crisp it seared my lungs. I hauled myself through, collapsing onto damp grass. Grass, soil, wind. The world tilted around me. For a moment, I didn't even realize I was crying. Ellis fell beside me, ripping off his mask and vomiting onto the ground. His breaths came in violent sobs. He tried to stand, stumbled, then grabbed my shoulder in a trembling grip. "We made it," he whispered. "Daniel, we..." The earth behind us rumbled, a low, deep vibration rolling up through the cave mouth we'd climbed from. Not a roar, not a collapse, a pulse. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats again. Ellis staggered back from the opening. "We go," he said. "Now." We left our tanks, our gear, everything. We ran through the Kentucky forest until dawn painted the treeline gray. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station 10 miles away. We didn't explain anything in detail. No one would have believed it. They sent teams to the cave system later. They found the original entrance partially collapsed. They never found the shaft, or the fissure, or Davenport. They found one thing, though, a fresh drag mark on stone near the collapse site. White, even, leading deeper underground. I quit cave diving 2 days later. Not because of what touched me, not because of what followed us, but because, when something pushes you forward in the dark, it means it knows the route better than you, and it isn't trying to kill you. Not yet.